Good evening, friends. My name is John Meyer. I want to let you know that I have worked for Pendle Hill for many, many years. I am retired from that position now, but I am also have been involved with the working group of decolonizing Quakers, which grew out of a conference that we held at Pendle Hill toward right relationship with Indigenous peoples that was held in 2018. Both Pendle Hill and Decolonizing Quakers are co-sponsoring this event. And Tom Kunish, who is our major presenter this evening, is on the working group of that organization. It will be in the resources that are being sent out, and you can follow up with decolonizingquakers.com to find out more information. Before we begin this evening's program on land acknowledgement, and I'd like to welcome back those who were here last evening, and welcome for the first time those who are new to our this webinar. I'd like to say that we're going to repeat some of the information that we did last night. I am happy to be presenting this evening on a clear video and clear audio, and I apologize for last evening's unfortunate situation. I wound up buying an iMac today so that I could be with you and be clear. So I'm so happy that you will not have to listen to a scratchy, crackly voice. Before we begin, I want to allay the concerns that have been raised by a number of folks that perhaps land acknowledgement is just a nod in the direction of Native peoples and is really perfunctory or performative or is designed to make Quakers feel good about themselves or to feel superior to other white people who are not doing land acknowledgements. And those temptations might be present, but the idea behind our offering this webinar is, as the title suggests, a first step towards right relationship, and far be it. It may be it could be a challenging and a complex step because of the research that may be required in order to establish who were the original inhabitants of the land on which you worship or work or live. But it is only a first step towards establishing relationship with both the land that you're on and the people who inhabited and cared for the land and for whom it is a sacred element in their being, and reestablishing our own relationship with the earth and its components and its living beings is a step in the direction that we all need to take in order for our planet to survive with human inhabitants. So with that having been said, I would like to read to you Pendle Hill's land acknowledgement. Pendle Hill is situated in Lenape-Hoking, the homeland of the Lenni Lenape people for at least 12,000 years before European contact, and probably a lot longer. Lenni Lenape means original people, and they are respected as the grandfathers by other Native Americans in the Algonquin language family that prevailed all along the East Coast. Before contact, the Lenni Lenape lived in numerous small, loosely affiliated communities along the rivers that are on the watersheds of the Hudson, the Lehigh, and the Delaware rivers, embracing all of what is now New Jersey, a good part of Delaware, and all of eastern Pennsylvania. Within the first 100 years of contact, violence and disease killed an estimated 80% of that population. And as European colonists settled this area in greater numbers, most of the Lenni Lenape, now more commonly known as the Delaware, were pushed west, those who survived. first into areas in western Pennsylvania, then into the Ohio River Valley and on into Canada. Later Indian removals scattered different elements of the Lenape into Idaho, Wisconsin, Missouri, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas. Some of the Lenape, however, stayed behind in Lenape-Hoking, hidden in plain sight, as they say. Today, there are 3 state-recognized Lenape tribal nations within the original Lenape-Hoking: the Nanticoke Lenni Lenape Nation near Bridgeton, New Jersey, the Lenape Indian Tribe of Delaware in Cheswold, Delaware, and the Ramapo Lenape Nation near Mahwah, New Jersey. Pendle Hill is seeking deeper relationship with these nations through their tribal leaders. We are grateful this evening to have with us one of those tribal leaders, Chief Dennis Coker, as a respondent to Tom's presentation. Without further ado, let me introduce tonight's speakers. Tom Kunish and 12 siblings. I better turn on a light so I can see what I'm doing. Tom Kunish and 12 siblings were born to a Standing Rock Lakota tribal member mom and a white lawyer dad, and grew up good and Catholic, as he says, in Minnesota on what had been Dakota and Anishinaabe contested land. He joined the Navy for adventure and the GI Bill, became a linguist, served in the Persian Gulf, the Indian Ocean, and Spain, and studied religion. He works today at being a dad, protecting and educating about Indigenous sites in Tennessee, attends Nashville Friends Meeting, and hangs out at the intersection of religion, decolonization, atheism, and quiet. Chief Dennis Coker is the principal chief elected, serving his 25th year as the chief of the Lenape tribal nation of Delaware, and is responsible for obtaining state recognition for that group of Native Americans who have lived in the same place since the beginning of recorded history. He's also been very active among friends, has very generously donated his time to people at Pendle Hill, Haverford. The University of Delaware has consulted on many issues related to the telling of the Native story in this part of the world, and has worked tirelessly with both the federal and state governments and the regional areas to preserve the purity of the Delaware River Basin. And we're delighted to welcome a friend to be commenting on Tom's presentation. We're also very happy to have with us Nia to go there, PhD. Nia grew up on the Turtle Mountain Reservation in North Dakota, which is her father's reservation. Her mother's reservation is Rocky Boy, Montana. Her tribal ancestry itself is Cree. Her spiritual quest has led her back to her ancestral roots that profile her efforts and advocacy for our living planet. We are so honored to have with us these Native Americans to enlighten us about how land acknowledgement can be a first step in building right relationship with Turtle Island and its beings. Please join me in welcoming our speakers for this evening. One brief note before I do that is many of you submitted questions at our last session on Tuesday evening. Those were submitted to Tom and the respondents, and they will be responding in writing, and that will be coming to you along with the resource list so that we can entertain questions that arise in this evening's program. And perhaps that will lead us to another opportunity to be together simply for questions and answers. But rest assured that those will be addressed and submitted to everybody who is participating in our program. Thank you. Tom, can you take it over from here, please?
Good evening, everybody. My name is Tom Kunish. I live out here in the suburbs east of Nashville. I lived down in Chattanooga for 30 years, and so most of my activity has been down there. I'm from Minnesota and grew up there 19 years, and then I left for the Navy. And but most of my education, especially about land acknowledgement, has been down here in the Southeast, where I was completely ignorant, completely. Uh, didn't know about the Cherokee, didn't know about the Choctaw, sure as heck hadn't heard about the Yuchi, and only heard about Muskogee from that country western song. So it was it's been a revelation to me in 20 years of studying, because uh, everything, almost everything that I had been told down here in the South, in Chattanooga, and even now in Nashville, was wrong. So it took me a long time to find out who to trust, who to ask, um, how to check what they said as being true or not, and who to have relationships with of information gathering and trust. One of the first things I want to say is that oftentimes we think of land as a thing. It's outside the window, it's what we walk on, it's what we drive on, and very rarely do we ever walk with our bare feet on it. But land is where, to some people, to many indigenous people, land is where spirituality emanates from. It's that contact, it's that relationship between the grass, the trees, the animals, the birds. That's been one of the most marvelous experiences down here in Chattanooga and east of Nashville now, has been that when I was growing up in the 60s in Minnesota, central Minnesota, we rarely saw hawks, eagles, groundhogs, almost anything. It was almost empty growing up. And I never figured it out until going back to Minnesota in the 90s, when I saw turkeys and I saw a fox out in the countryside, and I was going, how did that happen? And it all turns out because of DDT had made raising babies so dangerous, so problematic, so fragile for animals in the 60s that we just didn't see them. Thank goodness they're coming back. So when I talk about land and relationships, I'm talking about walking out there, walking outside, walking in bare feet, um, seeing the animals, talking with the animals, the trees. It doesn't have to be a Dr. Dolittle kind of thing. It's not that for me. It's just the amazement of the natural world that the land means to me. And so this is an interspecies genealogy. This is my relationship with the land and who the people were here, and finding out about the Yuchi and the Muskogee who used to live here in both in Chattanooga and in Nashville area. This is one of my favorite pictures of Turtle Island, the land on top of the turtle. Before we start, I always want to talk about the English language that we use, which should be some of our second or third language, or never a language. But for many of us, it was our first language because the language had been taken away from our family, our family members. My grandpa was the last person to talk Lakota uh, in the house. But that, given that, I want to say that if you ever hear me say something using words that you think are problematic, please say ouch in the comments. Lena will tell me. I'm not looking at comments at all while I'm talking, so it will have to be later. But ouch is for things that you hear that are problematic to you and that maybe we should, or that we should learn about. Oops is when you make a mistake. Sometimes I may say, oops, I'm sorry about that. And then woe is when you hear something that somebody else has said about somebody else, a third party, and you say, whoa, that's not the way that we should be talking about it. But it's a colonial language, and it has its classes and its biases built in, including the bad words that, if you like Latin, if you like good English words, caconym is a good word. From caca and nim, meaning name. I like to tell people that I'm offended by the cultural misappropriation that Columbus practiced, and then all of Spain, all of Portugal, all of England, everybody got in the bandwagon of saying people here were Indians. Not true. People here have tribal names, whether it's Tsalagi or Lakota or Nadene. And if we are concerned about cultural appropriation in other aspects of our lives, with Halloween coming up or mascots and stuff, we should be sure that we always address the elephant in the room around land acknowledgements and native issues, is that Indians are from India, not Turtle Island. Also want to say that my family is Lakota. We learned the word Sioux as kids, and many tribes still use it. But to learn that it's an exonym, it is a name used by Anishinaabe or Algonquin speakers to the east. When the whites came into that area and they encountered Anishinaabe people, they said, "Who are those people over there?" And they said, "Those are the Nadawasiu, the little snakes." And they said, "Oh, we'll just make this word shortened and we'll make it French spelling and we'll call them the Sioux." That's not a name that's indigenous to Lakota language. And so it would be good if we all learn to say that there are Dakota people in Minnesota, there are Lakota people in North and South Dakota, there are Nakota people in Montana and Canada, and of course, we're all over the place. But to use that word, those dialectical terms for people instead of the colonized name. And that's one of the things we're trying to do, is get away from colonized language. Same thing applies to America, named after Amerigo Vespucci from Italy, then from Spain. America is a colonial enterprise of Europe. It is not an indigenous enterprise. Indigenous people are not from America. To say people are Native Americans kind of means that people came, that America always existed. It didn't. It was a creation in the 1500s by Europe. So I reject that term too, Native Americans. I like the term indigenous. I know that Dennis likes the name native. Good word. I also want to say that we need to look at the words Hispanic and Latino as being European words for generally mixed blood people of Avia Yala, which is the area down south of Mexico or south of Panama. It's a new word to me. And we can also call them indigenous people. But calling people who live down there, especially native people who live down there, Spanish or Roman, which is what the words Hispanic and Latino mean, we're calling mixed blood or fully indigenous people, Spanish and Roman, without any consciousness of doing so. I hope that tonight raises that consciousness. Gotta check in with my lady. Tuesday night, we covered how to do this, how to write a land acknowledgement. Choose the land area, whether it's Chattanooga, Philadelphia, Jackson County in Mississippi, wherever you choose a specific land area, you research and collect the histories, both native written and white written, hopefully also black written. You check with county historians. Not all county historians pick up the ball and run with it before time existed. This map up here, it's really interesting. It's a map of Tennessee, and it's put out by the state of Tennessee, and it says that the Cherokee, Chickasaw, and Shawnee lived in Tennessee. They don't mention the Yuchi, don't mention the Muskogee, don't mention the Choctaw. I wouldn't trust any white histories as far as land recognition goes, or land acknowledgement, and I'm concerned that there are a lot of historians who just repeat what other people have said in the past. But there are good county historians. The woman who's the historian for Davidson County here in Nashville knew everything. Very impressive. So that's also a good contact to make, county historians. You then write the history, check it around with your people, with local archaeologists, local anthropologists, hopefully people who have known other tribes and are familiar with the history from the year 1000 on up to 1500 and on up to 1900, whatever, and can comment and help you with it. And then to give it to the tribe that you're going to be talking about. Always, we should affirm the autonomy of tribes to say what they want to be said about them. Of course, we can always comment and criticize it or challenge it, but we should always check and also provide them with some agency, direct input into the words that we say and use. That was the easy part. As John brought up, as many people have brought up, what's the use of land acknowledgements, especially when they are so similar to hopes and prayers? Here's a beautiful picture of all the hopes of the millionth shipment of hopes and prayers that were sent to Standing Rock years back in fighting Black Snake that went under the Missouri River. Oftentimes, I guess what this means is that land acknowledgements can be performative, as John mentioned, and they can make people happy thinking that they did something, and really it can be empty. So I asked the question on Tuesday, why? Why do we do these things? If they are hopes and prayers, if it is performance art, if it's Quakers feeling better themselves and patting ourselves on the back, why do it? In fact, shouldn't we be criticizing ourselves and not doing it? Now, I asked all of you to write down your comments on why land acknowledgements. I didn't get any in the questions that we received on Tuesday night. So I'd like to take a minute of silence, a minute of quiet, and ask if you can rack your brain and send in your comments into the chat about who benefits. Better yet, let's just go on and see if you agree. To me, the purpose of a land acknowledgement is to recognize a tribe that was here and to work on a relationship and to establish a relationship with that tribe and get land back to that tribe. That the land was illegally taken, and that the land acknowledgement is for us to recognize the tribes that were here, establish that relationship, and get them land back that was wrongly taken. Who benefits? We need to ask ourselves, is there a financial incentive for people to do land acknowledgement? We have done one here at Friends Meeting in Nashville, and there's no financial incentive for us to do it. In fact, I'm hoping that there's kind of a financial disincentive to do it, and to highlight that there is a moral incentive, and that is to be in right relationship with the earth and with the tribes, and that is to get the land back. And that always in the answer, we should ask, who is being centered? Who is the focus on? Is it white people doing white written or English language land acknowledgements for other white people? Or is it white people doing land acknowledgements for red people or for black people? And ultimately, who will benefit from this? And always the answer should be red people, native people, indigenous people should benefit from a land acknowledgement. Now, I told you on Tuesday that how was the first step, and that there are 7 other steps. And to jump the gun, land acknowledgements should lead to land back. I'll get into a little bit of what that means in just a sec. But if you need to leave anytime soon, just know that land acknowledgement leads to giving land back to native tribes. Somebody asked a really good question on Tuesday, and they said, well, how about some examples? Here are several. 300 acres to the Mashpee Wampanoag. The United Methodist Church returned land to the Wyandot, who were removed to Oklahoma, but they returned Ohio land to the original tribe. Tribe of California bought back, Big Sur, Esalen, 12,000 acres themselves. The Passamaquoddy tribe received $335,000 to buy back some of their original land. And what else are other people doing about it, and what are Quakers doing about it? This next part, Native Land Reparation Pledge, comes from Gail Melix, Wampanoag of East Coast. I'm going to mess up the state, so I'll stop. I won't say it. I just know she's Wampanoag, I think Massachusetts. And she is suggesting that people take this pledge of donating 1% of the sale price to a local tribe or indigenous rights group. We'll work on that. Hope to beef it up. I only have a half hour left, or 20 minutes, so I'm going to run through these steps pretty quickly. You're free to take screenshots, and if you want to do all the 8 steps in order, you can do them individually, or at the end of each, I will have a compilation of all 8. The first step is the easiest. What we just talked about is writing the land acknowledgement, but it's treating the stealing of the land change, both the land and the people who were removed as victims of a crime. The crime was the empire's colonization, and we need to learn what the doctrines were, what the teachings were, what the treaties were, and what the takings were exactly, and identify, or that's that. And then to identify ourselves and the group that we belong to as settlers and occupiers. That's going to be uh, a tough second step. It's a big step. Learning the doctrines, we'll get into that, the treaties and the takings. Uh, that's a whole nother half-hour conversation. But the second part is identifying yourself and your group as settlers and occupiers, not as people who own the land. When we talk about this land, or when we sing the song by Woody Guthrie, "This land is my land, this land is your land," I hope that every time you hear that, that you question whether that is right or wrong, and who you identify with and who is being centered in that song. Learning the colonizing, elimination, and settler assimilation process of empire. These can be complicated words, but basically it's acknowledging that the United States and England were empires engaged in a colonization process, which is taking foreign lands and generally removing the foreign peoples from those lands, settling their own people there. And then when there were remaining native people there, either eliminating them or assimilating them with like what people call the boarding schools. I call them assimilation and indoctrination camps of America, of the European process to make everybody American, which is often exactly what happened down in Abya Yala. Too often we talk, or we don't even acknowledge the universalism that's one of the basic points, basic testimonies of Quakerism, and that is seeing the good, seeing that of God, seeing that of good in all belief systems and all peoples. And we oftentimes, when we go to a land acknowledgement, we don't pay any attention apart from history. Universalism, to me, says that we have to look at the moral perspective, or look at what is good in the native peoples that were here, learn their stories, teach their stories, adopt what is good in those stories, and start seeing land from that other moral perspective. Outside of that, into our own whiteness, back into our own whiteness, land acknowledgement doesn't really say anything, just the words, that we have to know the desires, the wants and desires of the empire, and what it is and how it is that empire got to take all of this land and displace people. In Algeria, it didn't happen. In India, it didn't happen this way. In Hawaii, it didn't happen this way. Here it happened that there were laws, there were letters by the Pope, by people in power, to take that legitimized, that legalized land theft and enslavement of people. We need to check how this land, if I'm talking about Tennessee, how the treaties of this land were backed up by the USA's original land takings from England, and how England was justified in its takings by the Roman Catholic Pope. Next step is to uh, go to visit the original people of the land you live on. It's hard here in Tennessee because all the Muskogee, Yuchi, Cherokee people that lived here in Tennessee were removed to Oklahoma, 800 miles away. But it still needs to be done. And whether it's by writing, by telephone, or coming, visiting them when they come here and go to powwows or engage in NAGPRA conversations, Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act conversations, contact needs to be made, and it needs to be made on a human level, on a person-to-person, eye contact, and out on the land. One interesting story when I was down in Chattanooga is I think it was 15 tribes were invited to come down to Chattanooga to talk about Moccasin Bend, which is the largest, it's 956 acres, largest single native piece of land that was donated to as an archaeological site to the federal government, to the National Park Service. They did that because we stopped it from going anywhere else or being developed into a outdoor drama place. The National Park Service called in these tribes, these 15, 18 tribes into Chattanooga, and there I got to meet the first speaker of the Muskogee Creek Nation, and Wilbur Gouge. And he came back several times, and we went out to visit him in Oklahoma and to talk with the Five Civilized Tribes Cultural Preservation Committee. It was wonderful. But one of the interesting things he told us that night we were talking in our motel room was that he was an older man. I think he was about 70 years old at the time, and he said that every time he went out to Chattanooga, back to Tennessee, came back, he got sat down by his elders and got a talking to and reprimanded for going back east, for going back where they said that they would never go back, that their land was taken from them, it was robbed, stolen, and that they were marched out in chains, and never to look back, quit crying, live in Oklahoma, and that's it. And that's one of the reasons why we never heard of Muskogee, why I never heard of Muskogee down here in Chattanooga. Big important thing is to go visit the people and not to seek anything from them. Not to seek attention, not to seek information, not to seek affirmation or confirmation, but just to be, and eventually something will happen. This part sticks in my family's craw because I'm mixed blood. I'm one side, my mom's side is from Standing Rock. The other side participated in a lot of, what do they call it? Settling the land, homesteading. My family homesteaded over 400 acres. We need to determine our own participation in the removal, the settling, the occupying, the conversion of the land from red space into white space. And that's a factor in genealogy that Ancestry.com can help, can find out. And then to determine your own individual, family, and communal responsibility. My family has just begun talking about how to deal with the 400 acres that our family homesteaded, our white side homesteaded, and should we be turning any of our land that we own now as individuals. The eighth step is the hardest, and that is to return land. Some people donate their own parcels of land to tribes. Some people buy a parcel and give it. Some people give money. Either way, the land needs to be returned. Some land needs to be returned. Earlier in this presentation, we saw, I think it was 5 or 6 different examples of how tribes reclaimed land. So there's land return, and then the goal here, at least in Tennessee, I hope it's that way in Kentucky and West Virginia and other places where you saw those removals on Tuesday night. Even the tribes on the East Coast that have been decimated need to have their people settled back there again, and people who were removed into Wisconsin, into Ohio and Wisconsin, people need to be able to go back. I am hoping that we can bring Muskogee and Yuchi people back to Chattanooga and back to Davidson County. And the thing is land is needed. Those are the 8 easy steps. Land acknowledgement to land back. That's the, however you get there, just get there. Here is the all 8 of them together, if you want to take that screenshot. I have to take a sip of water now. Most people don't like to hear that they are on stolen property, stolen land. And Bruce Cockburn of Canada, one of the best kept secret of Canada, sings a song about stolen land. And lots of people think, well, this land was bought by somebody. It was treated somehow. We got it. I was shocked to find out how much of New York was outright taken, just claimed by the United States as theirs in opposition to the existing tribes, and with no other explanation given, just taken. If we had our cars stolen from us, we would expect it to be returned to us somehow, even if it was damaged, to be returned. And if it was damaged, we expect that if we were able to catch the person, that they could make restitution, reparation for it, and give us our car back or something back in its stead that would be just as valuable. I think we need to start considering the land that we are on as stolen property, and that we need to religiously pursue returning the property that was stolen back to its rightful owner. Don't know if you guys have ever seen this. It's an amazing short bit of history written by an Episcopalian priest. Christianity started in Palestine as a fellowship of followers. It moved to Greece and became a philosophy of thinkers. It moved to Italy and became the institution of an empire. It moved to Europe and became a cultural ethos, and it came to America and became a business enterprise. I'd like to review those last 3 lines. It came to Italy. Christianity came to Italy and became an institution of an empire, the Holy Roman Empire, which then morphed into 2 different empires and then validated all of the secular empires, the Spanish Empire, the Portuguese Empire, the English Empire, the German Empire. It moved to Europe and became a cultural ethos. And then it came to America and became a business enterprise. That's what we are engaged in now, is looking at how land has become a business commodity, and how it wasn't that way 500 years ago, and what the cultural ethos says about stolen land. Going from land acknowledgement, which is just simple history, to land back, which is giving that land back to those simple historic things, there's a problem in there. Is how does land back justify, or how does land back, how is it justified giving it back to these people? What if it was really taken or traded for, if it was really bought, if it was really purchased legitimately? That would be something different. But what we found is that Columbus used the doctrines of Christian discovery and domination in order to justify the taking of land. Anybody that wasn't Christian automatically gave up all the rights to their land, not by their choice, but the Pope said that. And it validated what Spain and Portugal and England wanted. So we have these many letters. This list over here on the side is 4 letters written by the Pope that says authorized Portugal and then Spain to conquer Muslims and pagans in Africa. Remember that Spain was the only country in continental Europe that was forbidden from sending people, warriors, knights, to take over the Holy Land because the Muslims were inhabiting Spain and inhabited Spain from 711 to 1492. Over 700 years of land occupation in Spain that the Spaniards themselves were fighting to reduce slowly but surely the amount of land that Muslims controlled in Spain. And in 1492 was the conquest of Granada, and that is what financed and allowed the kings, the Catholic kings they call them, to finance Columbus's trip to the west, to the west. This was done before, these letters were written before the discovery, and it was so that Portugal could go along the coast of Africa and claim and take things. But we oftentimes think that it was the Catholic Church that did that, and that they really didn't affect much anything else. England used an 1155 letter by the Pope called Laudabiliter to say that they owned Ireland. In 1496, England had another guy, same like the Pope, that said that any land that Spain and Portugal don't get, England can have, and you guys go get it, to John Cabot. And then in 1681, in the time of George Fox, William Penn was given 45,000 square miles by virtue of a king in England never having visited, saying, yeah, it's yours. So that presents a huge problem to Pendle Hill and to everybody else, especially all Quakers living in Pennsylvania, is how do we deal with stolen land? America, US, United States of America, is not exempt from its own doctrines. And was just reading these 2 incredible decisions, one in 1823, one just 17 years ago, in which the Supreme Court said anytime that we want land, we can take it. Doesn't matter if treaties were written, it's ours to decide that we are the sovereign owners of all land, and that tribes are essentially residential domestic nations within us. The city of Sherrill versus Oneida Nation bought more land that was on its original reservation, on its original lands back in the 17 and 1800s. The U.S. took them. The Oneida Nation bought more land and said this is now tribal land, and the city said, don't think so. We still want taxes on that land. And it went to the Supreme Court, and actually the state court agreed with the tribe. Went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, by 8-1 decision, said, all that stuff was over 200 years ago. We have a new law system in here, and you were paying taxes were being paid on it. Those taxes are still owed and still under control of the city of Sherrill. So the doctrine of Christian discovery and domination still exists and is still practiced in the United States in this century. The hard steps, I'll go through these. pretty quickly because some of them are the same. Uh, Most people won't want to do this because it takes into consideration or makes us consider what role does our morality, do our principles, do our testimonies play in uh, acknowledging land and giving land back, or yeah, giving land back. First, so often we don't acknowledge the original people as crime victims. We say, "Oh, sorry, you were hurt by the boarding schools. You were hurt by the massacres and the slaughters and the smallpox and the disease and wiped out 90%. Them's the breaks." We don't consider that the United States especially participated in the murder of people and the outright theft of land. And to me, that's what's most important is not who was here 200, 300, 400 years ago, but what happened to the people who were here and how did they get gone. So we identify the local lands. What we haven't done is talked about the profits that have been derived. Most of the land was taken on the, well, all over the place, taken for land speculation. George Washington was a land speculator. Everybody that came through here in Tennessee in the early days, right after the Revolutionary War of the U.S., were land speculators, buying, selling land that had been taken. And that's also why the uh, Cherokee were removed from North Georgia and Southeast Tennessee, was that there had been a gold rush in Virginia that subsided. Then there was another gold rush in Georgia around Dahlonega, and people wanted that land and they wanted the natives gone. Nowhere in other land acknowledgments do we mention, or does anybody mention, that England and USA are empires and they act like empires in their colonization, their settlerism, and their occupation of other people's lands. They sure as heck don't name it as land theft. And you notice I spelled wrong. Um, well, we can get into that some other time, but in no other concept, in no other plan of land acknowledgement have I ever seen anybody say that people should admit to receiving stolen property and that it is morally wrong, it is theologically wrong, and that it is a sin. And most especially, people don't want to hear how our Christianity has participated, in fact, initiated, validated all of the takings from native peoples, the killings, the enslavement of native peoples, and that even our own denomination, our own meetings, our own yearly meetings have profited uh, by what the U.S. empire has done, what the English empire and U.S. empires have done for us as whites inside this denomination. We don't often talk about sin. It's something I've tried to get away from in my Catholic upbringing, except that it's such a good word of meaning that you know something is wrong and you go ahead and do it anyway. In the 1500s, the Pope wrote a letter that said that you can't enslave Native Americans. That was not extended to African Americans. It said that you could forcibly baptize people and then you could kill people if they didn't agree or get baptized by you. Awful in the Southwest and even in the Southeast. We need to name what those sins are between murder and land theft and talk about them as theological cancers that have been growing in our denominations, all of the denominations, for the past 500 years, and that we have participated in that land theft, and we have profited from it. Here's the hardest step. If we agree with that, then that means that we should repudiate, renounce, and repeal all the doctrines of discovery. That means that we have to go back to the 2015 decision of the Supreme Court and say that was wrong. We have to go back to the 1823 decision and say that was wrong, and that we will not abide by it. We should not abide by it. That is probably the hardest call of all, is to challenge the legal basis on which all people own land in the United States, apart from native indigenous tribes. But until we renounce these doctrines of discovery, they are still on the books. The Catholic Church has not repealed them. And the United States government says this is the only way that will protect our land from tribal claims. It's still wrong, and it's still land theft. The seventh is to draft a policy about returning land. And the last one is pretty preposterous, to commit 10% of all of our land sales as Quakers, as Catholics, as Jews, as Muslims, anybody living in the United States should be committing 10% of their land sales. And I think of budgets as moral documents, as moral statements, and that if we really believe in land acknowledgement, which means land back, that we ought to take steps to fixing that stolen land and getting it back to its original owners. Those are the 8 hard steps. If you want to take a screenshot. And then just a couple more statements. Don't often talk about moral health, but I believe that we are morally damaged when we think that this land is ours, that when we do land acknowledgement, that we acknowledge that there was a moral damage done by the rules of Europe that were applied to the Turtle Island, and that this was moral damage, and that it requires moral repair, same as any other kind of physical damage should require physical repair. Repeal and repudiate the Christian doctrines of discovery and domination, and reject. I'll just leave this for you to consider, that growth, development, and sustainability are all words that apply to occupation and settlement and ownership of land and development, changing that land from what it was under native ownership into something different, into something white-owned, and that we should reject it. Sustainability is what's getting us into trouble with climate change, and that we need to reject it. So we are kind of in the first step, or second, third step, where at least some Quakers acknowledge that we are colonizers. We hope to also to recognize ourselves as occupiers, and to use the same language that's being used in other countries to challenge our own moral righteousness here in Turtle Island. Winding up, I think the Catholic Church has accumulated a lot of moral damage, and We expect popes every time a new male is elected, to try to walk back some of that moral damage that they have done. We need to acknowledge that it is in our own institutions here in the United States and here within our own yearly meetings and monthly meetings that our possession of stolen property is tantamount to moral damage that we are living with. Lastly, this is a great podcast. It's in the resources that I have attached, that I've given over to Lena and to Pendle Hill to share with you. But you can see in there, it's not easy listening if you don't come from that perspective that this land is stolen and that land acknowledgements lead to land back. But it is great history. Here are the resources, and I have put them all in a one-sheet PDF that Lena has, and I think, Lena, you can share it on the chat too, right? And by email. And those are the other resources for decolonization, which we haven't talked about much at all tonight, but there at the bottom is Decolonizing Quakers, the website, contact there. And the greatest, these are all so good, but I really encourage you to watch Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's TED Talk on the danger of a single story, and to consider that Christianity has been America's single story for the past 500 years, and that it has replaced all of the stories of native tribes here in Turtle Island, and that we need different stories, and we need different stories within Quakerism. And the next one is Tuck and Yang's Decolonization is Not a Metaphor, and I think that's what most people have been inspired by when they say you can't do land acknowledgements just for performance or just to sit on them, to say you did it. It means land back. And that's it. There is my mascot, a big snapping turtle coming out of its hibernation in the spring. Thank you for being here these 2 days and for listening to me. And I turn it now back over to you, John.
Thank you so very much, Tom. I'm hoping that we do have some time for our respondents, Chief Coker and Nia, to add their thoughts. I urge people to, given the shortage of time that we have left, despite a very informative and probing, provocative presentation by Tom, that if you have questions, that you submit them in the chat, and we will endeavor to have those responded to by the people in writing. I'm afraid that we have reached a very late hour for having our respondents have a chance to respond, and then also to entertain questions during the period that is remaining to us. So I'd like to invite either Nia or Chief Coker to grab the microphone and offer their observations and responses, comments, or questions that have arisen to them that might frame Tom's talk in a different perspective, or your own personal experiences as they relate to the topic this evening. Thank you. And thank you again, Tom.
So, John, I can just have a couple of comments real quick. This is Dennis Coker. Tom did an excellent job of giving us a roadmap for this land acknowledgement, land back movement. And, I'll be the first to admit that the journey is not easy. It is not an easy journey. Here in the East, it's been 500 years since first contact. Many of the tribes that are west of the Mississippi really didn't have contact until the early part of the 19th century. Their cultures are very much still intact. But here in the East, it was just devastating what happened to the native peoples of this land. And, we even struggle today. And if it wasn't for some partnerships with some of the Delaware tribes, the keepers of the culture and tradition, I'll refer to them as that left early because they were already in Ohio and Western Pennsylvania by the middle of the 18th century. We've been forging some friendships with our cousins up in Ontario, Canada, and they refer to us down here, still in our homeland, as the keepers of the land, and trying to return some of that culture and tradition to its original place. And we're finding that very challenging in our own right. Native to native, it can be very difficult sometimes. But we've had a couple of opportunities to experience some largesse from our non-native neighbors. We had an offer of a piece of ground that was on the Pennsylvania-New York border, and about 7 hours away from where we reside here in Cheswold. And I had to gracefully decline acceptance of that piece of property because it just wasn't feasible for us to care for a piece of ground that was 7 hours away. There was maintenance to be done. There was just a lot of logistical issues. We even tried to steer it to one of the Pennsylvania groups that are not recognized, but even they, only being an hour and a half away, found it to be challenging to accept a piece of property. So, and then we had a discussion from a lady in Chester County, Pennsylvania, who had an Indian burial ground on this hill that she owned. And it was a sizable hill, and it was a grassy hill. And, she looked at us as a possible recipient of that piece of property. And we even found that challenging to commit to accepting and maintaining. She ended up giving it to one of the federally recognized Delaware tribes in Oklahoma, because they have many, many more resources than we have here. And this hill was like a 45-degree angle, and mowing it must be a chore. But recently we've been gifted a couple of pieces of property. Well, one is a done deal. Another one is soon to come, hopefully by the end of the year. But both properties that we're looking to receive are environmentally compromised pieces of ground. They both had to go through an environmental assessment. One property, the largest property, it's 11 acres. We can never ever drill a well on it. And and when someone wants to give you something, you don't want to insult them by refusing it. But in some cases, it's necessary. The second piece of property, which is the 2-acre piece that shares a border with the larger piece, the 11-acre piece, was the site of one of our early schools, the Fork Branch School, that the Delaware State Police took in the 1960s and turned it into a small arms training facility for their state police cadets. So it's got this big berm in the back of it that's just polluted with lead. And they're in there right now, mitigating that pollution. And so our response to this has been that we need to regenerate this property. We need to show our non-native friends that we can steward land properly when they couldn't to begin with. So we've decided to find a silver lining inside these clouds somewhere. So we're creating an edible forest garden on one property. We're getting rid of all the invasive species that are there. We're bringing in native species. And it's really drawn a lot of very positive attention to us as people travel past these properties. And that's the sad thing about property, because the colonizers have literally destroyed, I mean, to the point that it's unusable, the property in North America. I mean, the soils have been sterilized, the water is polluted, the air is polluted. It's very, very difficult to manage these properties without resources. So we have been fortunate to have pacts or agreements that allow for maintenance endowments, realizing that we're just so underfunded that we need help even after we get the property, even to regenerate it, to restore it. So when in this land back movement, I think that there should be considerations made for once you identify and you are committed to land back to a particular group, we need to sit down and talk with those groups just to make sure that you're not gifting them a problem, because it's not, some of these remedial activities are not cheap. I mean, we're stuck with trying to figure out what we can plant on these properties that will remove heavy metals, and we can't even eat anything we plant on there for fear that those heavy metals will be transferred into the fruits of the vegetables or even some of the trees. So, I applaud Tom. You did an absolute excellent job. I think you hit every talking point out of the park, and I learned a lot from it. And I just, I don't know really what to say other than, last summer, we completed a project of designing a new concept cultural center for our tribe. And it's an awesome facility. It's zero carbon footprint facility. We're hoping it will be an educational, cultural, and environmental education center. We want to associate it with a community-supported agricultural project. You know, so we're looking at probably 30 acres of land, you know, 13 acres for the cultural center and 10 or 12 acres for the CSA. And, you know, it may be challenging for us to even do that. It may be. I don't know. I'm optimistic, but I'm also cautious with my expectations. And but you never know. Ask and you shall receive, right? Thank you so much. Thank you, John.
Thank you so much for that cautionary note and adding the perspective of what it is you're giving back and how is it going to be maintained, and will the recipient be able to use it in a way that makes sense for that organization and their resources. Thank you so much for that. Nia, we'd like to call on you for your reflections this evening.
Yes, Tansikia, how are you? One of the things that comes to mind is, what are the underlying values and beliefs that perpetuated colonization to begin with? I think we really have to honestly ask ourselves, what values and beliefs shaped doctrines, led to policies, and led to all of the various other things that took place to implement colonization? I just want to point out historically, back in 1405, prior to Columbus visiting the Americas, in 1405, Admiral Shang set out from China with an armada of 300 ships, 27,000 troops. He traveled around the world, all the way to Africa for 30 years. The amazing thing is, at no time did Admiral Shang colonize the people he encountered. His whole goal was to actually learn from the people he visited. He wanted to learn from. And so contrast that with Christopher Columbus in 1492, who began our, demise, so to speak. But if you look at them culturally, they come from totally different worldviews. And my wish and my hope is that we take a really reflective look at what values and beliefs today that we are all immersed in, what values and beliefs perpetuate the doctrine of discovery, perpetuate colonization, that give momentum to systems that actually carry out these value systems. And I think in asking those deeper questions, what we're looking to do, and I'm hoping that we begin to realize that we have to shift the paradigm we are in. In other words, the cultural shift has to take place where we begin to question, okay, so what values and beliefs do I have that is really putting me in the story, squarely in the story of colonization? So when we step back and we say, whoa, I do live in a country that is really into the paradigm, into the belief system of power over, into a belief system that says I can manipulate all of the resources, into a belief system that says that there are some people who are less than and some people who are not as good as I am, or whatever it is. And so it continues the story of inequality. It continues the story of destroying our planet and so on. And so yesterday, I spoke very briefly about how we traditionally, in our earth-centered perspective, Indigenous people saw themselves as integral to the landscape. Their sense of identity came from the living earth. They saw themselves as integral to the landscape. They were not separate from the earth, from the air, from the water and the fire. And we have to recognize that when we do the land acknowledgement, it's the beginning of something that could be really transformative and magnificent. Because there is ample evidence that this mindset of manipulating the living earth is really self-destructive. And Tom mentioned in his presentation, moving from 1% to 2%. I actually want 100%. I want your heart. I want your intent of living in a reciprocal relationship with us as Indigenous people. I have interacted across the United States with tribes in New York, all 22 tribes in New Mexico, North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota. And yes, we are hurting. Yes, we have a fragmented past that is causing us trauma, and people call it the soul wound. But we are heart people. We want to work together. And my firm belief is that we have to work together. Otherwise, we are not going to resolve the issues that keep coming back over and over and over again. And I know I'm on the last few minutes here, and thank you for being here. But I want to end with Tom's question that he asked on Tuesday: who benefits from land acknowledgement practice? The ones who benefit from land acknowledgement practice are our progeny for the next 7 generations. You benefit. I benefit. Turtle Island benefits. The other than human world benefits. We are on the cusp of an emerging story, but we must be committed to our allyship, to our relationships, and to our abiding belief that this dream is not only possible, it is more than likely probable. One of the things I'm trying to do with the Bozeman Friends here in Montana, by the way, we have 12 different tribal groups in Montana, and I'm trying to sell them, I'm doing a sales pitch. In other words, I'm saying, okay, one of the things that I would love to do is to take you to different reservations and immerse yourself in listening to different perspectives. I did this on my reservation in Turtle Mountain. So students came from Augsburg University in Minneapolis. They spent 3 days on my reservation, and this is what we did. The goal was to have a sense of where the people are, who they are, and listening to varied opinions. It was magnificent. I had the physicians from our hospital speak on how they are trying to bridge Western medicine with some traditional herbal practices as we are learning more about our culture. I took them to one of our 5 schools. They interacted and attended a class of a teacher who was teaching Indigenous history from an Indigenous perspective. We had a medicine person do a ceremony of the peace pipe ceremony. And then we had opportunities to interact with people, just a cross section of people across Turtle Mountain. And it was beautiful because they had a sense of, oh, I see that different people have different perspectives, that this is their place, that they're having a sort of quandary of who they are based on a collective trauma, if you will. And so I think we have to work together. And when I say 100%, I'm not looking at geographical location or landmass. I'm looking at us giving our entire being to relationship. I'm radical, but I love that word radical because it really means being rooted, being engaged with each other. And when we were in the immersed in the, needing masks and so on, some of my friends were calling me, asking me what to do. And I said, no, don't ask me. Because the Crow people down the road, the Cheyenne people, you've got to ask them. Go to their tribal website and see who you can talk to or who you can call. And that, I said, will be the beginning of establishing, as Tom mentioned, just going and sitting and visiting. And of course, when we're in the middle of COVID, you don't want to go sit and visit necessarily, but at least begin to ask, how can I help if I wanted to help, and so on. Well, anyway, so thank you in my language, Kitata Mian.
Thank you, Nia. I believe our time is up for this evening. I thank Tom, Chief Coker, Nia, for your valuable time, your insights, your wholeheartedness, your speaking truth when it's difficult and important to do that, because we have to start with truth or we don't get anywhere. And we have so been fed lies and ways of thinking that are unhealthy for ourselves and the planet. Tom, before we close for the evening, do you have any final thoughts briefly to share with us? And I will remind folks that you will be receiving the questions and answers that you have posed from Tom and the respondents. And you'll get the resources that have been listed. And also, since you have signed up for this program, you'll get notices of upcoming programs related to ways of doing land back, reparations. I know that Nia and Gail Mulix are really interested in doing some work on healing, both on a native from the native perspective and on the settler colonist descendants perspective, and healing together. And I know that we would like to hear more about the, I will call them the indigenous boarding schools, but Tom's term of internment, re-education camps resonates with me when we think about the Uyghurs, for example, as an analog to what was done to our native peoples here. So there will be other opportunities for us to gather again for further reflection and information sharing. Tom?
John, no, I don't have anything else to add. You said it very well. Thank you.
In that case, let us all be very thankful for our guests this evening and for their time and sharing such valuable words of wisdom with us. Thank you again, and thank you all for participating. And I look forward to our upcoming opportunities to be together again.
Wanishi.
Wanishi.